Pastor Greg, and I have the joy of sitting here with Dr. John Tyler, who's a friend and an amazing scholar. And let me just tell you a little bit about him. He has gone to the law school at SMU, has a PhD in philosophy at A&M as well, and a BA in philosophy, summa cum laude at A&M as well. So a lawyer, a scholar, a doctor in philosophy, which is amazing. His interests have intersected law and government and an emphasis on the United States Constitution. So that is perfect for us today as we talk about this. Multiple award-winning writer on many articles in law journals. And so you just have done so many things, and we're so grateful for you. And I just appreciate your friendship and just enjoy being with you today.
It's always great to visit with my friends at First Baptist.
Well, it's a blessing. Thank you so much. Well, let me just ask you some questions. We'll jump in. How did we lose the Christian worldview in our government and nation? You know, when did this really speed up of all the things we're feeling now?
These symptoms, if you were a physician looking at a body, began to emerge in 62, but the roots of the problem really began much earlier. So I explained to my students that we're really in a spiritual warfare, and I believe that spiritual warfare has intensified now. And if you don't understand that we're in a spiritual warfare, then a lot of the things that happen in current events are not going to make sense to you. So in my view, the spiritual warfare manifests itself in human history in four different fronts. There's a spiritual front that includes the legal war on Christianity that we've had, the cultural attacks on our family that we have. There's an academic front where professors are teaching our students. I gave a talk at River Oaks Country Club in which the title was, "The Greatest Threat to National Security is Our Own Universities Now." And we're seeing that play out, unfortunately, on many of our universities across the country now. There's a political front, and then there's also a legal front. And if I could, the spiritual warfare really began in Isaiah with Satan's 5 I wills, and then in Genesis, God predicted that there would be, enmity between the enemy and man. And then what we've seen is different aspects of that spiritual war take place. So in the academic arena, which is kind of where I am now, the legal arena is where I used to be. But in the academic arena, there are several people that are really quite important, just a couple I want to mention. The first one is, of course, Karl Marx. When I went to graduate school, I was really shocked to find out how Marx has been resurrected and is now easily the single most important intellectual influence in the West, no doubt about it. Marx predicted that economic conditions would cause a worldwide revolution in 1848, and it didn't happen. Lenin comes to power in Russia in 1917 and 1923. He predicted the worldwide revolution would happen at that time, particularly in Germany, and it didn't happen either. So intellectuals in the Marxist world began to panic and wanted to understand what was happening. And the man who's now probably the most influential thinker is a man that most Americans have not heard of. His name is Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian communist. And Gramsci diagnosed why the Marxist revolution had failed. And in his diagnosis, he actually gave the game plan that's now being followed around the world, but particularly now in the United States. And so he said that there were three reasons that Marxist revolution failed. And the first one was Christianity, the second one was nationalism, and the third one was private charity. And so his strategy then is to attack those areas. Marx also argues that you need to destroy the family in order to bring about the revolution, and we're seeing that manifest itself as well. Then in the political front, we have a progressive movement in our country that many people may not have heard of if they're not part of the movement. But the largest caucus in our Congress is the Progressive Caucus, the very largest one outside of the party caucuses. It was founded by Bernie Sanders, who's an open Marxist, and it was the current chairman and the vice chairman are two members of the so-called squad. And they have adopted Gramsci's views and his methods as well. And they are a very strong political force, and they greatly influence events and politics today. But then to get to what most people are familiar with in the legal front, We began in 61 a series of cases that followed up, that they were not intended, I don't believe, by the justices to do this, but they did fall right into Gramsci's number one strategy, which is to attack Christianity. And Gramsci says the revolution needs to be a quiet revolution, he called it. People shouldn't be aware that it's going on. But the first thing to do is to get rid of Christianity in our institutions. So in 61, I think Engel versus Vitale outlawed school prayer in public schools. A couple of years later, or 62, I think the Abington School District outlawed reading scripture. In 73, a case called Lemon versus Kurtz outlawed any tax aid being given to parochial schools, even for secular subjects. And then the really worst of all the cases in my lifetime, well, maybe in our country's history, was in 1990. And this was a case entitled Employment Division versus Smith. And it took away, for the first time in our history, what's called strict scrutiny protection from religious liberty. And religious liberty is our foundation liberty and the most important of all of our liberties. And strict scrutiny protection holds that government cannot in any way interfere with people's religious exercises, their exercise of their faith or their church, unless it's absolutely necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. It's a very, very high standard. And that was taken away. We have 40 rights in our Bill of Rights, 40 of them. And the only one that was ever taken away that lost strict scrutiny protection was religious freedom.
Wow.
So in 1990, that opened then a flurry of legal attacks on Christianity. Just three of the cases, I think Hobby Lobby was fined $475 million a year because they wouldn't give abortion-causing drugs to their employees. The Little Sisters of the Poor, a group of generally elderly Catholic nuns, all they do is give poor people who are dying a dignified place to die. They were charged $70 million a year because they would not give abortifacient drugs to the nuns. And then our own small university here, and then Houston Baptist, now Houston Christian, under your leadership, for which I thank you, was fined about $13 million a year, which is not a lot of money compared to Hobby Lobby, but it's more than our faculty budget every year, and it would have destroyed. So there's no need for the government to do this other than to try to eradicate that. Yeah. But the good news is, and I taught for years, and my common law course would end with Employment Division versus Smith and how terrible it was. And I would lay out what to pray for. To please, the case that we need to have happen is a case that would restore the strict scrutiny protection to religious liberty. And I told my students for decades, I will never see it in my lifetime. I hope that you see it in yours. And then, of course, with most of my predictions, I was completely wrong. And in 2022, the Supreme Court restored strict scrutiny protection to religious liberty in a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. It was the Christian football coach who had been fired because after the game was over, he would lead prayer service for both sides after a game. So that's good news and upbeat. And I've got to say, I was just amazed. It was from a legal point of view, it was a miracle that happened. Never thought I would see it.
Well, that's amazing because I love you giving those things. We all feel it, just in culture, but we don't know the case by case and this and that and how it is. But it's since the 60s in particular, it's like it is just going woo like this. And I feel it as a pastor. You feel it in the community. You feel it in the culture. What is the proper? We always hear separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. How are they supposed to relate? What's that connection between the church and the state?
Well, I tell my students, and more than half my teachings on the Constitution and common law, there are three places that we go to find out what the Constitution says: the text, the text, and the text. And for 2,000 years, Western law has said that in construing legal documents, use the normal and ordinary meaning of the text. So I will often offer $1,000 cash, and I'll have it in the classroom to any student who can find the phrase separation of church and state in the Constitution. And it is not there. And it is a legal fiction that was developed specifically for the reason of limiting religious liberty. So the issue of church and state is a very, very fundamental issue because religious liberty is the origin of all of our other liberties. That all of our liberties in the Bill of Rights came from this 500-year struggle for religious liberty in England and here. And if government controls religion, they can take away all the other rights as well. And so the first country in the history of the world to give full, meaningful religious liberty to everybody, regardless of their faith, was the United States in 1791. So there are three provisions that deal with religious liberty in the Constitution. The first one is the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, and it says that Congress shall make no law establishing a state church, and it prohibits a government church being established, as almost every other country in the world still has today. And it prohibits any favoritism to any religious denomination or group with regard to the government. The second clause is the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting free exercise of religion. And that gives us the freedom not just to worship as we choose, but to live our lives according to our faith as well. And there's no separation of church or state there. The third provision that deals with religious liberty in the Constitution is in Article 6, and it's called the No Test Act Clause. And in England, there was a revolution over a statute where you had to pass a religious test to be a kindergarten teacher, to be a college professor, to be in the military or in government service in any way. And so that was to prohibit that so that everybody has the right to run for election, regardless of if you're an atheist, agnostic, Christian, or whatever your belief is. And that is the totality of what the Constitution says about religion. So if you read these terms together and the rest of the Constitution, what we see is that the Constitution absolutely forbids government interference with religion and government influence on religious activity. But there is no prohibition about religious influence in government activity. And this idea that there's a separation of church and state is a fiction. Yes. I'll just tell you one thing. When I taught at A&M for several years before coming here, the beginning of the con law section, I'd ask all my students, can anybody here tell me one provision in the United States Constitution? And some of these kids are extremely bright. A&M was tough to get into. And in 5 years, I had one student raise his hand and said he knew a provision. I said, well, what is it? He was from Qatar, because A&M has a campus there. I said, well, what is it? He said, separation of church and state. So this fiction has been so well established that even in foreign countries, that's all they know about the U.S. Constitution, but it's not true.
It's not there.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I've said before, if there's separation of church and state until the state needs the church. So, and I actually spoke in front of city council in Houston, and I made the statement, you don't want to go through a hurricane without the church.
That's for sure.
Because we did 80%, churches and nonprofits did 80% of the help. Government did 20%. And we want, as a church, we want to help. You know, that's one of our mandates is to help the people in the community. We want to do that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. You get a little stiff arm until a hurricane starts happening, and then can we use your facility for this? Can we do this? Can we do that?
Right.
Of course, the answer is yes. We're going to do that because of our hearts for the Lord and to help people. But it's a little bit of a one-way street, decided upon which how they want to do that. And from what you're saying, which is obviously right and true, it's just not in the Constitution. It was in a letter, I believe, that Jefferson wrote. Is that correct?
It was in a letter that he wrote, but Jefferson did not write the Constitution, and the founders did not pass the Constitution. The reason we have a Constitution is because we, the people, ratified it. That's right. And that's why when we construe it, we have to use the ordinary language as it had meaning for them when they voted for it. Constitution is a literal social contract. Yeah. We gave our forebears, people who stood in our position, gave our word that we would abide by it. And it also allows us to change it if we want to. But you can, people who are opposed to the influence of Christianity particularly, and Christian values in our political and in public forum, try to grasp on that but it's just an argument. It's not a constitutional argument.
That's great. What policies today in debates have biblical roots? You know, I'm trying to help people along with, what are the policies? And there's a million policies that are out there, but what ones have biblical roots?
Well, I want to go back to my first view is that we're in a period, I think, of intensification of spiritual conflict. And so almost, in my view, almost all the major issues that we face today fall into four groups. One of them is an attack on our family that Marx outlined in 1874 in a book called The Origin of the State, Family, or Property and Family. And it's very, very clear. And you can take the book and read it and see exactly what's going on. So let me talk about that. Then the other three come from this Antonio Gramsci I told you about. But Marx's attack on the family, Marx, not to bore people, but Marx believed that capitalism was evil and he wanted to get rid of it, but he realized to do that he had to get rid of private property. And his view was that the family was the origin of private property, so you had to get rid of the family. So many things that are very common to us today, but were radical at the time. One of the things that he argued was to not make it illegal for women to do household work in their own homes. The state would supply that to get these women out of the home and make them less financially dependent on the man. They wanted free public education, not to educate the children, but to have the opportunity to indoctrinate the children as they want, and to break down the parental-child love relationship and education at home. Other things that they wanted were a radical new sexual morality, to break down the bond between husband and wife, break down all kinds of traditional notions of gender roles, and embrace new types of sexual relationships and embrace them and approve of them. And the word that he used was he wanted them to be temporary and fluid. So the result of all this is that you break up the family and then you destroy, that helps them destroy private property and bring about the revolution they wanted. So many of the things that we see in our schools today will fall right into his game plan. Now, the one that's a little bit more sophisticated is Antonio Gramsci's. And of course, he said it was Christianity, nationalism, and private charity that were the reason that Marx's revolution failed. And they formed the basis of his strategy today. So the first thing he wants to do, limit the impact of Christianity. And I've even heard people say in political meetings I've been in, if somebody's made a Christian reference, well, you can't talk about that. That's your religious belief. We can't talk about that in politics. Well, that's right out of Gramsci's teaching. You get Christianity out of the educational system so that you can groom the new generation's elites free of Christian views. His whole idea is to replace Christian and capitalist values with Marxist values. And so you do everything that you can to destroy pride and patriotism in the country. So for instance, we have a whole generation that's being taught, that literally taught, like in the 1619 Project, that the real reason for the founding of the American colonies was to establish and perpetuate slavery. When we know from the documents, the real reason, as stated in the legal documents, was to fulfill the Great Commission and bring the word of Christ to the New World. You have, there's an article today in Wall Street Journal editorial where the Speaker of the House is being attacked now in the left media for being a white nationalist. And that's the whole thing, is if they make fun of people that want to put our country first, like that's something that's really archaic and anachronistic, and it's a childish fetish to be in love with your country. So we end up having, for instance, this mass immigration is an attempt, a very cynical attempt to use these people coming over to try to change the structure of the culture and the country. So we have our attacks on Christianity, attacks on nationalism, and then the third area, attack on charitable or private charity, particularly Christian charities. An example of that is how governments across the country have shut out Catholic adoption agencies because the agencies don't want to let their children be adopted by anyone but heterosexual couples. And so they get axed out there. So these are some of the things that are driving all this. But there's a reason behind what looks like just a crazy hodgepodge of strange events. And to understand this is really the reason I left my law practice and went to grad school, because I could not understand it otherwise.
That's amazing. You know, you don't realize there's so much behind the scenes. It just seems like, oh, this happened and this happened, this happened, but there's a playbook in a sense.
One of the problems with the Christian community, Christian academic community, is we tend to isolate ourselves from the things that are contrary to our belief system instead of learning them and understanding them, and therefore we don't see the significance of them sometimes.
Oh, for sure. We just put our head in the sand.
Right.
That's so true. When we talk about partnerships, you know, no one person, man or woman, can run the country or run the city or run the state, and you know, any political entity. I sure can't run the church by myself. The university can't run by themselves. What appointments does the president have the power to make, and why are those important?
What a great question. Outside of wartime, the single most important thing that the president does, from my point of view, is appoint Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices are not elected. They can never be recalled. They can theoretically be impeached and removed from office. One justice was impeached, but he was not removed from office. In the entire history of the country, of the tens of thousands of federal judges we've only had 7 of them removed from office. So it's a lifetime appointment, and one of the flaws, in my view, of the Constitution is that there's no check and balance on the Supreme Court. Nobody reviews the Supreme Court's decisions. So I teach constitutional law. That's my main area. And we have a saying that constitutional law has very little to do with the Constitution. It has to do with what the judges say. So there was one Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, who said in the 30s, I believe, that we have a Constitution, but the Constitution means what I say it means. And I am the guardian of your liberty and your property, not the Constitution. Unfortunately, that's how many of them think. And so consequently, the whole study of constitutional history is the expansion of the power of the federal courts to where now they literally believe they can intervene in any aspect, and that's not what their central role was. So having good justices appointed is absolutely crucial. And for instance, the 3 appointees by Trump were tremendous appointees, very high character, excellent scholars, and understand the legitimate role of the Supreme Court, which is to adjudicate disputes and not to transform the Constitution to meet with their own private conscience. Now, in addition to that, the Attorney General, the policies that the Attorney General follows has become increasingly more important as our courts have become more and more weaponized. So the Attorney General is a really important position as well. And then, of course, our military leadership is really crucial. My dad was a member of the Greatest Generation. He had to get his parents to sign a waiver when he was 17 to become a B-17 pilot, had a life expectancy of 30% maybe. That was that generation. The leadership that they had in the military there was some of the greatest in world history. I worry about now, 2 generations later, what our current leadership is going to be like, because they've been indoctrinated with many of the ideas that are causing us problems in other areas. So, but the Supreme Court appointees are by far, in my view, the most important ones.
And are all federal judges a lifetime appointment, or just the Supreme
Court? Most of them are. From the district court up, okay. They are.
So that's a big deal. No matter, I mean, we always think of the Supreme Court, which is the biggest deal, but
right.
All of those are
there's
crucial.
3 levels and that are really important. Then you have lower levels that have terms like bankruptcy judges. Used to be 14 years, okay. But the life appointee is the gift of Alexander Hamilton, who also wanted life terms for senators and life terms for presidents.
Oh my goodness!
Unfortunately, we defeated. They defeated him on that. Exactly right.
That's really great. How can the candidates' party platform show the future of their appointments and people they're going to partner with?
It's very easy. You can read for the buzzwords. So if people were to go to the Progressive Caucus's website, you'll see the entire litany of all the phrases, such as equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, climate justice, social justice, those sorts of things. Those are all terms that are used by those who are wedded to transformation of our culture, so that you can tell from the words what their policies are going to be. And if you do just a little bit of research into who their supporters are, then you can predict who the affiliated parties are going to be based on who their big campaign contributors are going to be. And that's true on both sides. So one of the things that I look for is what kind of judicial appointees do I think the president will make? Because one of the things that people don't appreciate, 30 days after a Supreme Court opinion becomes final, even the Supreme Court cannot go back and change it. Now, they can say in the future they may not follow it, but they cannot even go back and change it. They lose power. It's set for stone forever. So there's this permanence of mistakes. If Congress makes a mistake, it's very easy for them to repeal the law. And if they don't, and we're unhappy about it, we just have to wait 2 years to change it. But you have to wait for a death or a retirement.
And maybe even numerous deaths.
Yes.
To really.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I found an interesting way of getting a lot of information is just reading the party platforms.
Absolutely.
You know, and most people don't do that. We just look at the candidate, and not just in the presidential, but in all of them. Like, what is their group? You know, you'll know a lot about my preaching if you'll read our statement of beliefs.
Exactly.
And you'll know exactly what it is. And so you don't have to really wonder about a church by just looking at the pastor. You can look at the statement of beliefs, and he should be walking in those. And the same thing, a political party is going to be what the candidate's chosen and be able to show that as well. That's great. What do you think about the person? You know, there's candidates, you know, all different levels, but how important is the candidate's faith and worldview?
As a lawyer, my greatest skill, and any lawyer, is to be able to predict what's going to happen in a certain situation. To predict, to come up with a strategy for a case, predict what was going to happen. I had to be aware of cases that were similar cases that were going, similar cases that these judges had heard before, and you go to school and try to understand that. I only had clients in a case, and if I lost the case, nothing was really horribly destroyed, although I felt terrible. But with the world in which we live in now, and the danger which we have, and the willingness of so many people now to do terrible things to other people, the ability to understand why things are happening and what things are likely to happen in the future are really, really important. And if you don't have an understanding of human nature, if you don't have a knowledge of past history, you're going to be doomed. You know, there's a saying, unless the light of the past lights our way, we're bound to stumble in the darkness. And that's very, very true. My students sometimes ask me, what's a great example of a president that had a worldview that enabled him to succeed? And I always say Ronald Reagan. Reagan doesn't get enough credit. I grew up, my generation, ducking and covering in elementary school as if that was somehow going to save us from a nuclear attack. But he ended the Cold War. You know, as a child, I lived every day with the threat of possible nuclear attack. He ended the Cold War and brought down the Soviet Union without firing a single bullet. Think of that. That's just one of the most amazing achievements of history. But his understanding of, I think, God's plan in history and where the United States fit into that plan, I think gave him insight to make enlightened decisions about what to do. I was reading an article the other day, if you were reading at the time when he came up with Star Wars, it was ridiculed all through the media. He was just pummeled for it. And now that's exactly the technology that saved Israel from the missile attacks that we recently had and that we depend on now for our own defense. Mm-hmm. So I think it's absolutely crucial. Mm-hmm. Another thing I think that a lot of people don't sufficiently appreciate is understanding what motivates extreme Islamic terrorism. And they have an eschatology, belief in things that are going to happen, that they believe that through terror they can bring about the emergence of their Messiah called the 12th Imam or the Mahdi. that will then restore kind of an Islamic version of Christ's millennial kingdom. The Mahdi will rule the entire world at that time. And I believe that's a false narrative, obviously. But what's significant is that there are people who are willing to act on it, and if you don't understand their motivation, it's hard to predict what they're going to do.
That's amazing. Yes, for sure. Well, those are the things of the worldview that if you don't see it from Christ-centric worldview,
Right.
and how this whole thing is a part of history, and you only look at your little part of your life and your moment at this time, you don't see the bigger picture that's playing out. That is so true. How, when we think about elections and our ability to participate, what kind of price has been paid for us to vote? Because it's a big deal to vote, and sometimes we're like, well, it's raining, I don't know if I'll vote. Oh, I don't want to stand in line. But what kind of price has been paid to give us that privilege?
500 years of sacrifice and death to get to that. It's literally that far. The right to vote, what we call popular sovereignty, with the people over the government instead of government over the people, is really an American invention. And to get to that, we had to go through the Reformation. Then we had to go through, in the 1600s, 3 civil wars in England. Then the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England. And then we had the American Revolution here. And then the Texas Revolution, all for that one right. And people who don't vote, I hope they're from the party of the bad candidate, and I hope that they tell their friends that and persuade them to stay at home. But, the Lord doesn't tell us to just do the things that we think are big. We're supposed to be good stewards. We're supposed to love our neighbor. And part of doing that is being responsible when it comes to choosing our leaders. And so it's a very big responsibility and a privilege. And I have no patience for those who are not motivated to go and participate.
Right. I always say, and not like I came up with it, but if you don't vote, you can't complain.
That's exactly right.
So you've got, if you don't vote, you've got X amount of years, and that whatever that term is of whatever you're voting on, that you can't complain, because it's just you gave up your right, in a sense, to complain because you didn't take that vote. And we always try in our family, we vote early. Part of early voting, it's very easy. There's polling places all over the place, and so that participation is a key element. So I'm with you on that. Let me ask you a question about a couple things about peace, and not necessarily world peace is not where I'm going, but the peace of the individual. We're so stressed out. We watch the news or read the paper. The sky is falling every day. Something's gonna churn up. How can we be at peace as believers in Christ, obviously, but how can we be at peace in the midst of such division and turmoil?
Well, I always turn to Scripture, and I've got nothing new to say, but it's the old familiar ones, like, fear thou not, for I'm with thee, be not dismayed, for I'm thy God, or Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, which is my favorite verse. It's the one I use every day. 23rd Psalm, when I'm really stressed, I'll recite that. I remember I just took it for granted as a vanilla thing until I saw The Elephant Man. I don't know if you remember the movie The Elephant Man.
I do, yeah.
And at the end, they were saying he doesn't understand what he's saying because he was reciting the 23rd Psalm. And then at the end, he gives the last 2 lines. And that's how they knew that he was a thinking person. And that made such an impact on me. I memorized it that night. And so I probably say it to myself 10 times a day. But we can also look at history. God makes promises, and God keeps them all day long, every time. And if you want to have a historical, if Scripture's not enough for you, which it should be, but if you want a historical example, you just look at the history of the Jews, for instance. God promised them that in the covenant that I will bless those who bless you, and you'll be a curse to those who curse you. And just in the state of Israel, gave a lecture on this the other day. In 1948, when they fought their first war for independence, they were outnumbered personnel-wise 40 to 1. 40 to 1, and God preserved them. And it was in prophecy that the state of Israel would be brought back. Then in 1967, the Six-Day War, they're outnumbered 2 to 1, but the enemies had great weapons advantage over them. They won. And then in the Yom Kippur War, they were outnumbered 3-1. And that was a surprise attack on them, and they still survived as well. So God promises, and the Jews were attacked in the Exodus before they even got to the Promised Land by a nation that wanted to wipe out their entire race. So this is something that they've, which I think is part of the spiritual conflict that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. But God will preserve us. God will preserve us. Mm-hmm. And His will is perfect, and we need to take comfort in that. And it's a mistake to take comfort in our leaders. It's a mistake to take comfort in our economy. These things that we can't control, but we can rely on the promises of God, and that will get us through.
The Prince of Peace. I said many times in messages that peace is not the absence of crisis, it's the presence of Christ.
That's nice. Yes, I like that.
We're never going to have a time that there's no crisis. In any history, in any family, in anything, there's always something going on. But it's not the absence of crisis, it's the presence of Christ. So let me ask you this question. Do you have a favorite story? You know so much history and so many things. A favorite story in American history, maybe voting or candidates or elections, something that's you just want to give us that great story.
I really do. It's the story of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So Adams was president, running for re-election in 1800, and Thomas Jefferson was running against him. Of course, they had been compadres during the Revolution and friends, but they were now political adversaries. And many people say that this was the most unpleasant election in our history, most adversarial. And so after the election was over, and it's a very important election for all types of constitutional reasons, but our Marbury versus Madison came as a result of that. Adams loses the election, and so he puts these little plants people in the new administration to try to torpedo Jefferson's agenda. So anyway, it's a very important election. They don't speak to each other for 12 years. And then the man named Benjamin Rush, who was another one of the founders, he was a physician, he gets the idea that he wants them to get back together. Everybody's getting older now. So he sends Jefferson a letter saying, I talked to John Adams and he wants to heal things with you, which was not true. Uh-huh. Then he sends a letter to Adams saying, I talked to Jefferson and he wants to make up with you, which was not true. And he told them both in the letters that he had a dream that they would both die at almost the same time and they would be greatly honored by their country. Well, they end up sending 167, I believe, letters back and forth to each other, and solve their differences. I don't want to say they were best friends, but they were. The letters are very excellent letters and very kind and considerate letters. And then they both died on the 50th anniversary, July 4th, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, within hours of each other. And Jefferson died first. And Adams didn't know it when Adams's last words were, at least Thomas Jefferson still survives. And it was, Jefferson had already died. But anyway, I just think that's a wonderful, wonderful story.
Yes.
I tell my kids every July 4th.
Love it. That is a great July 4th story. Great story for any day. Well, thanks so much for just serving in the ways that you do and being a professor here at Houston Christian University and all your study, all your knowledge. We're benefiting and gleaning from it just in this small time together. And just want you to know, we just appreciate you so much.
Well, I appreciate you the chance to visit with you.
Oh, yes, my joy. For sure.
Real pleasure.
For sure.